Well, let me just introduce myself a little bit. I'm John Jackson. I am a construction scheduler by trade. I got into scheduling 30 years ago, actually developing scheduling software for a large construction company. Then I've spent the last 30 years as a schedule consultant. Prepared schedules, reviewed schedules, and about 20 years ago, I got got involved in a lot of dispute resolution as my career developed. And in that last 20 years, I have spent a lot of my time doing dispute resolution, but at the same time, running a scheduling organization that oversees several hundred projects at any given time. And so I get to see a lot. Part of this series that Encore Group is putting together is a lot of lessons learned that I've learned over the years. So today's portion of that is 4 ways to identify issues with construction schedules. And what I'm referring to there and what you'll see in this presentation is issues with schedules that could easily be identified in order to avoid problems, identify issues early, being able to resolve issues as they come along. So we'll just jump right into it. If you, as I said, if you have any questions, just plop them in the question box and I'll get to those toward the end of the presentation. The first thing I want to point out today is that the scheduling tool is a great step for risk management of a project. It's one of the best tools I know of to help an organization or a group of project stakeholders identify issues as they surface. They have the ability to assess potential risk ahead of time, as well as once an event occurs on a project, and then to manage that risk and or delay, whatever the issue might be, through the process up through the resolution. And I just, that's as a background to what we're going to be covering today are just ways to put a good schedule in place that will help to identify problems on a project early enough to get a good, quick assessment, manage through it, and resolve the problem. It's just some of the basics there in risk management when it comes to schedule. The importance of reviewing schedules, there's a term that AACE, that's an organization, the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineers. They publish a lot of works that deal with scheduling, construction scheduling, and there's a process they call validation. In other words, getting a schedule to the point where it is valid for managing the critical path of a project. It has a valid critical path and is going to be a tool for resolving issues as they surface. And so part of in the forensic scheduling publication that AACE develops and keeps updated, a big portion of that process, particularly in dispute resolution, is making sure a schedule can be used. In other words, this quote here I have underlined: any analysis method, no matter how you're analyzing delays or issues, no matter how reliable and meticulously implemented, can fail if the input data is flawed. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, is how you can take these four ways you can look at a construction schedule and do a good, clean analysis. And as I mentioned, the 2 big issues that you're looking for in the construction schedule process is the validity of a critical path. The whole CPM method hasn't been around that long, but it's got some basic rules associated with it that we'll be talking a little bit about. But being able to make sure a critical path is valid and that a schedule can be used as a basis for time impact analysis. I have been involved in several disputes where a contractor has submitted schedules that just basically were useless when it came to developing or analyzing delays that occurred during the project. So some of the basic steps we're talking about today is just making sure you have a good, valid critical path and that the schedule can be used as a basis for a time impact analysis. Now, one of the challenges we have in the construction scheduling business, as I mentioned, I specialize in it. I help organizations put specifications together, all kinds of approaches to the construction scheduling process. I've helped establish procedures for organizations, all that kind of stuff. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that no matter how large of a specification section you write, it's very difficult to guarantee schedule quality. I was involved in just on the phone earlier today with one of our staff that's involved with a client that just doesn't think scheduling is important. And so trying to get that contractor to plan is a real challenge. And so the specs, we can help them meet the specs, but to really force an organization to plan is very difficult. And so there are some approaches that we're going to talk about you can take to address some of those up front. And here are a couple of basic how-tos on getting some good cooperation, and one of the best steps that I know for getting a good quality schedule. And the first is in the process of organizing a project, putting the project team together, having the initial project meetings, start delving into the schedule with both parties there. There's several reasons this is important. The scheduling piece of the project, it's one of the tools, in fact, I think it's the only tool that I know of on a project that includes everyone's scope of work, whether it's owners reviewing submittals, contractors, subcontractors, vendors, design architects, everyone involved in the process is typically has some functionality or some scope of work that's included in that schedule. So having meetings early on with all the stakeholders just to get the discussion going. In fact, if I'm working with an owner and I'm in the process of rolling out a project with a contractor, that's one of the first things we do, even before the contractor submits the schedule, is let's just sit down and start looking at it. That way, once the schedule's submitted, I've already had a chance to look at it. I've already been able to ask questions that I have, identify issues or whatever. So when the schedule gets submitted, it's much easier to approve if I've gone through a good meeting process. And as I'm sure most of you know that's been in construction for a while, the best opportunity to address a lot of issues is early on in the project. And so if you start that process early, you can overcome some of the quality issues that you might run into from a scheduling technique standpoint, just by addressing them before the schedule even gets submitted. That's a great idea, and you can easily put that in a construction specification. Then the second one that I like to see in specifications is really encouraging the contractor to update their construction schedule every week, doing look-aheads out of that schedule. You know, a lot of contractors will still want to do their spreadsheet look-ahead and break out things in detail, and all that's fine. But to kind of keep a big picture view of the project and where it is at any time is going to really, really help. So before we get into reviewing, I want to just kind of give you some basics. Most of you may already know this, but just some really basic understanding of the critical path. I taught at UNLV for a few years, and I used to make my students memorize this little chart because I've had so many times where I've asked project field personnel or managers, what is the critical path on the project? What of these activities that are going on? Which of these are the critical activity? And my response I've gotten frequently is everything is critical. And so I've learned over the years to really help people understand, no, if everything is critical, then probably nothing is critical. If you're measuring everything with the exact same intensity as all the other tasks, then you might as well not even have a critical path. So just so you understand, in a critical path, and you can see in this example, I have you can see I have a plumber here that has a little bit of float on it, right? You can see there's 2 days. The way that works, the way the critical path model works, and this is going to be, I'm giving you this because this information, because this will help you as we start looking at reviewing schedules. There's really 3 variables in a critical path schedule. There's scope, time, and logic, right? Your simple bar chart has scope and time, but the critical path schedule has logic. So it shows these relationships here from one activity to the next. Actually, the way it was initially developed, they would develop what they called a network diagram, where you would have what they called nodes tied to other nodes. You'll have to pardon my artistic deficiency drawing with my finger. But these nodes would all be tied together, and the whole path would start with one activity down here and finish with one activity right there. And then the calculation would work through that network to determine which one of those paths through that network was the longest path. But all of it had to center around scope, time, and logic. In other words, no activity can move, or no activity can be assessed or calculated when it's going to occur, with the exception of scope. That's the work that's going to be done, the time, how long it's going to take to do that work, and then how that work relates to other activities. That's scope, time, and logic. So it's essential when you're reviewing a schedule that's one of the questions that you look at. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So your time management and the critical path, the way that works is you can see here in the software, it's doing it in the background in the software, it's calculating this in the background. But it starts at day one, and it says if that activity is going to take 5 days, for example, we'll say Monday, it's going to start Monday morning. It's going to finish on the afternoon of day 5. That's called the end of day 5. You have beginning of days and end of days. So then the next activities can start on 6. If this underground electrical needs 5 days, then it'll finish on 10. My plumber will finish on day 8, 6, 7, and 8. And if my electrician finishes on 10, then my slab on grade can start on 11 and finish on 15. Then what the software does, it starts counting backwards. It says, okay, if you're going to finish on day 15, that slab on grade has to start on day 11. And my electrician has to finish on day 10, and so does my plumber. And if those both finish on day 10, my electrician needs to start on day 6. My plumber could start on day 8 and still make it all right. So it counts its way backwards, and then it takes the difference in these two numbers on the finish, and it gives you your total float calculation. My electrician has 0 float. My plumber has 2 days. So what we could see visually, this is how the computer calculates it. And this is important to understand. I'm giving you this little background here just so you understand how to look for things in the schedule that may demonstrate that things other than this are actually going on, okay? So here's one of the first things one of my first recommendations in resolving schedule issues and reviewing schedule plans is get a validated plan in place as soon as possible. Now, I see a lot of projects. Unfortunately, I see a lot of projects where baseline approval, what they call baseline schedules, your initial schedule, the project plan, where it just takes forever to get one approved. And I think there are some certain things that will justify rejection, but in the basic scheme of things, I try to get a plan in place as soon as possible. Here's what I've learned on that over the years. If you get a plan in place as soon as possible, you can start monitoring the schedule, and it will help identify, more issues with the schedule that will encourage more effort into planning and executing. Plus, I tell people this all the time. The beginning of the project is the most important part of the project for 3 different reasons. Number one, the beginning of the project is when most issues occur. Your design issues during the submittal process, your subsurface conditions during your initial breakup of earthwork. Usually during that period is when most issues surface. The second important thing about that period, that's usually one of the least documented periods of a project. In a lot of cases, just as I mentioned, the initial schedule goes unapproved for a long time, and therefore the contractor doesn't update it. So Therefore, you don't have a very good documentation in place for that period of the project. So it's when most issues occur. It's usually the least documented period of the project. And the third part about that phase of the project, it's usually when most issues could be resolved much easier because the relationships in a project are usually the best at the very beginning. People are much more willing to cooperate at the beginning of the project. And in fact, typically, the further you go down the project, the more difficult it is to resolve issues. Plus, you have more opportunities to resolve issues early in the project. When delays occur, you have more opportunities to really look down the critical path of the project and say, we could make that time up right here. The earlier you address it, the earlier you, or the more opportunities you have. I could go on and on. That's for a different webinar. My basic point here is get a valid plan in place as soon as possible. Then you can start to look at, looking at the option for analyzing that schedule to make sure it's good. So here's just some basic things you want to look at. Now, most of your software packages, Microsoft Project, P6, Power Project, they have built-in tools to help analyze a schedule, what I'm going to show you. I'm going to use a website, Schedule Validator. They have essentials. It's free to go in and upload a schedule and look at the validation. But like I said, this is similar to what you might have in some of your existing software. You can look at this kind of stuff. I use this package because it allows me to look at project, P6, or all of them in one place. So I can, with this deal, I'm going to just upload a project. And then I can select it. And it pulls up my my analysis for this project. So you can see here on my screen, I'm looking at a schedule. Let me just show you, these are some of the things that you want to look at. Like I said, most of these reports, you can find it in P6 or Microsoft Project, but you can look at these things. Here's one of the things you want to look at, your constraints. We talked about just a minute ago the importance of just scope, logic, and time driving your critical path method. If you're using constraints, in other words, you're artificially plugging in a date for a specific activity, then it's going to have an impact on how that schedule gets calculated. That's a big one. Another issue you want to look at is the critical path. How many activities are on that critical path? In this case, this project is towards the end of the project. There's not that many activities left, but I've got 9 activities. 43% of the remaining activities are on the critical path. If you have a baseline schedule and 25% of the activities are on the critical path, that basically means that 25% of the issues that might occur may have an impact on that end date. So that's an important thing to look at. You know, what's the percentage of activities on the critical path? Activities on the critical path, if you remember, if they're impacted today, it impacts the end date of your project. So knowing the percentage of your critical path activities is a big deal. Another one is near critical activities. You noticed in my chart a while ago, my plumber had 2 days of float, right, before it impacted the critical path. If an event occurs that's more than 2 days to my plumber, then it's going to impact the critical path. That's called a near critical path. One of the features on this site, I can actually go in and establish the parameters. I can customize my parameters to what's critical. Some projects, my near critical may be 2 weeks. Some projects, my near critical may be a month. I can customize that in here. But you want to establish how many near criticals, because even though the risk is a little bit lower, there's still a pretty substantial risk associated with near critical activities. Down here is long lags. Those are relationships with in between activities where there's nothing defining what that period is. For example, if I say after I start this activity, I'm going to put a 20-day lag before I start activity B. Well, that 20 days, that's a long period of time to not have a definition of what that 20 days represents. So long lags is another good one to look at. High duration, activities with extended duration. Duplicate descriptions, things that just may be unclear. If I select on one of these, if I select on constraints, this lists the constraints for me down here. So I can see, oh, okay, those constraints are okay. They're legitimate, right? Any of these rules, by the way, there are exceptions to them in some cases, but in general, these are things you want to look at. Obviously, you want to look at any activity that has no successor. If an activity has no successor, that means it's going to be calculating an inordinate amount of float. In other words, there's no reason why it couldn't finish the very last day. And the same thing with no predecessors. So those are little checks you want to make. Another one is open finishes. That's a little more complicated. That's an activity that's tied to the start, but nothing is tied to its finish. These are just different things that you want to look at. And if you on Validator, you can hit the print button, and it'll actually print out a narrative that explains each one of these, right? So this will help you. If you want to do that, it'll explain the importance of having a check on constraints, your critical path, your near critical activities, and it'll give you an explanation of what you want to look at. So that's a good tool for that. So number one, validating it for technical. That's basically the technical review of a schedule, making sure that it meets the CPM or the critical path method, CPM, of scheduling, the techniques with scope, time, and logic. That's the only thing that should be driving dates in theory. Like I said, there are exceptions, but keeping that to a minimum is very important. The second thing to look at in schedules is particularly deals with updating of a schedule. And one of the big issues with updating is determining what's allowable in an update. I've got up there posted a couple of specs sections out of one contract that I'm working with a client on, and the first section up there, it says the contractor shall schedule and meet with redacted monthly to discuss the current project schedule, progress of the work, and any potential changes to the current project schedule. And then it goes on to say the contractor shall submit all changes to HART for acceptance before such changes are incorporated into the current project schedule. So what's interesting here is that the owner uses that specification to limit changes. If they don't like a change to the schedule or an RFI or a change order that was added, they say, no, you can't change. We don't approve that change to the schedule. But then in the very same contract, several paragraphs later, it says submittal of the BPS, which is the baseline project schedule, and subsequent updated project schedule shall be understood to be the contractor's certification that the submitted schedule meets the requirements of the contract. In other words, it has to accurately reflect what's going on out in the field. So you have these two different philosophies in the scheduling world generally, and it's a very contentious debate that goes on many projects. How should you incorporate changes? What changes should be allowed? How do you manage those changes to the schedule and keep control of it? So that's one of the big things that you want to check in your schedules is what changes are being made. And just for my opinion, I think a schedule should be changed as things changed. I can't think of any project that I've ever been on, whether I was working with the contractor or with the owner, that did not have delays, did not have issues come up. Something was missed. Something needs to be added. This needs to be changed. So a schedule needs to be a dynamic document that reflects what's going on out in the field. But there seems to be a little confusion on that and some contentious. But once again, in your software, whether it's Microsoft Project, P6, usually you can do, I'm going to select these two projects here, and I'm going to just run a compare schedule. I'm going to run my compare schedules. And I can see here here are the changes that have been made. And you, like I said, P6 has it used to be Claim Digger, then it went to Visualizer, and I think now you can get it back with Claim Digger. But you can run these types of reports to find out what the changes are. I think you have the same thing in Microsoft Project where you can look down through these changes. But it'll give you the idea of here are some durations that changed. Here are some activities that were deleted, activities that were added. Here were some logic changes. And being able to go through that and see what changes, instead of having a blanket, no changes can be made, here is a quick tool to help you look and say, hey, these are the changes that were made. Why were the changes made this way? Or is that a good change? Does that reflect what's actually going on out in the field? So in the update process, one of the things you definitely want to check is the ability to see what changes are being made to the schedule from update to update, right? Once again, it's just a good tool to help you identify changes that are having an impact. You'll notice in a lot of cases that a lot of changes are made that really don't reflect what's going on out in the field. It's just the contractor in a lot of cases will just reschedule something and just start from scratch and add a whole bunch of new activities without keeping the old schedule. I don't encourage that kind of change. If you're attending today and you're a contractor, one of the issues you definitely want to avoid is what they call abandonment of your schedule. So as much as possible, you want to maintain that original schedule as much as possible as you go through the update. Make changes, make adjustments. You can even adjust that logic, but avoid changing the scope, like changing a description for an activity. This report will show that activity descriptions. This one doesn't have any in there, but if you change a description, now you're comparing apples to oranges in some cases. So just be very careful what you're making. And if you're reviewing a schedule, you definitely want to just keep an eye on what changes are being made. That's the second thing. The third thing, this is probably the most important thing you can look at in a schedule. And I've learned this over the years. I've spent a lot of cases where I have gone into a project. In fact, I had just actually the other day, I had a contractor, a project executive call me. We went riding around. He was showing me the project. He started telling me the story. The project manager had been turning in a schedule. They'd had delays, but the project manager was turning in a schedule every month, showing that the schedule was going to complete on time. And sure enough, the owner contacted my client and said, hey, we don't think you're going to finish on time. So he called his project manager up to ask him about it, and the project manager said, I quit. So all of a sudden, my client there is having to scramble on how he's going to get that schedule, how he's going to get that project finished, and he was pretty much out of time. Here's what had happened, and this has to do with managing milestones. This is a technique. This is not necessarily a textbook technique. But this is a technique that we've used in our organization as a scheduling company. We specialize in schedules and schedule reviews and delay analysis. These are techniques that we have incorporated into our weekly and monthly process on our projects to avoid it. It's using a milestone method, but the purpose of it is to manage what we call in our shop, we call it project creep. And what that is, that's where a project is slipping behind schedule, but yet changes are being made to the schedule to still show finishing on time, right? So in other words, from A to B is expanding a little bit. What was supposed to happen at B has now moved out, but adjustments have been made to show that the end date's still going to be on time. So this method, if you think about it, it requires these 3 milestones to be able to measure this. In other words, if any time is added in this period right here, if this date's going to stay the same, it has to be subtracted out of this period here. It's that simple, right? So the key is, how do you define that? How do you identify that? If I'm working with a contractor and their slab is slipping, right? Generally, one of the first things that happens, they'll say, oh, we'll be able to make it up later. And they'll just take time from other activities that are scheduled later, or they'll do some resequencing to try to bring it back. And so as a schedule reviewer, I want to know if that's what's happening. I go back to the old saying, if I can't depend on, if what you're telling me you're going to do next month, if you can't hit that, then I can have very little reliance or any kind of confidence in a date that you're giving me that's a year out. So I want to know that up front, right? Because what happens, sure enough, you get to the point, and this is where my friend was that I worked with, where there was so much time lost, there was no way they were going to be able to meet that date. So the question here associated with that is, what does on schedule really mean? So I've learned, one of the things I teach my clients all the time, when you ask somebody, is the project on schedule? If you have me, if I am, if someone says, are you on schedule? I'm going to make sure that I ask the question, what do you mean by on schedule? Are you hitting your dates? Or are you just showing the end date on time? So that's a big difference. So it's very important to know to me, if someone says I'm on schedule, that means I'm hitting my dates and I'm not having to adjust that end date. So here's what you're looking at when you're reviewing a schedule for this particular thing. There's 3 items to look at. There's the completion date. That is still important. But what you're looking at is progress on the critical path. Progress on the critical path. How did we do on the critical path for these activities that we said last month we were going to be paving on this date? Did we hit that date or not, right? That's progress on the critical path. I want to look at that. And then I also want to identify problems. Here is a sample. Here is a sample that of a little weekly chart that we do internally, where we put basically those 3 things. I try to get our staff I just want one sentence. How are we doing on the contract completion date? And then the second little box there is, how did we do on the critical path this last week? Did we gain a day, lose a day? What happened? So that I can see that whole project creep at work. Once you get that once that happens, what it does, it brings accountability to be able to let the people, project stakeholders know, whether it's subcontractors, general contractors, or owners, letting people know, hey, this week we lost 3 days because of this issue, right? And get that documented. That accountability, managing the critical path that way and bringing that accountability to the project can really, really help facilitate a good, structured, and a way of encouraging people to meet those dates. It's also great for issue identification. If we didn't pave on Thursday and now we're not going to pave till next Wednesday, that's a great opportunity to ask that question. Hey, what's the issue? Do we have a delay here that we're going to need to address? What are the options for early resolution? Is there a way we can do that? Yes, after that, we've got another activity down here, low risk activity. We can work that on the weekend and make that time up, right? It gives you early resolution options by identifying it early. And then also helps avoiding construction claims, which is just really, really big. Very, very good documentation tool. Now, Schedule Validator actually has a tool that'll actually do that for you, right? You can compare 2 schedules. Here I'm going to click on my critical path, and here it is. This shows that I'm comparing my September update to my October update. This gives me an analysis. It gives me my the narrative that goes along with it, right, for my report. But it's telling me here my first milestone is dealing with my data date, right, the date that I'm starting to measure from. My second milestone is my second data date, that B, right, that we talked about. In other words, what I said a month ago, when I turned in my schedule a month ago, I said that by today I would be right here. That's this second box right here. We call it the critical base activity milestone. And then the report goes in and lists all of those all the way out to the end date that will show where they are. And what's great about this report, you can see that my critical base activity I gained some time on the overall project, but the way that happened, I can look at this report, and this kind of explains it right up here in this narrative, but I can see all of these projects down here that where the dates shifted drastically, that a major resequencing was done on this project, and that's how that end date was brought back in the 31 days. Okay, so that's called that's a 3 milestone approach. That goes back to this slide right here, where you're establishing those 3 milestones to measure the progress on the job. So that's a 3 milestone approach where you're using the first data date, and you're using the first data date, and you're using the second data date, and then the end date as your 3 jobs. And it gives you a good critical path analysis. You can do that on a spreadsheet very easily. A lot of times I'll have my clients just set up a spreadsheet at the beginning of a project, and they will, and I'll have them put that spreadsheet together with, let's just set some milestones. What's the date you're going to switch? What's the date you're going to switch from phase 1 to phase 2 work, right? Or what date is your slab going to get poured? What date are you scheduling for dry-in? Or what's the various milestones? Set up a spreadsheet with those milestones, and you can see as those initial dates start moving out, you can actually start tracking if the scheduler is taking days out of the end to compensate for days they're missing up front, right? Once again, it brings that accountability in there. What this does, it helps you account for every day, right? What I like to do, I usually get down to the end of the job, and I've had to do this on a few jobs, few projects that went bad, but because we were doing this method of accounting every week to week, look and say, okay, we lost 3 days this week because of this issue. I was able to go back through and basically reconstruct from week to week what happened. You know, this week we gained 5, we lost 5 days, but the contractor lost 10 days, but they resequenced some work to bring 5 days back or reduce the duration, right? And then the next month there was an owner caused delay for 15 days, right? So now they're a total of 20 days behind, right? And so at the end of the project, I could come down through that cycle by cycle or period by period and identify at the end of the day, we finished this many days late. 5 of them were for this stakeholder, 10 were for this stakeholder, and here is how we can resolve this. This is where we need to end up in that process. So being able to monitor that critical path and monitoring milestones, managing milestones, set up some, you can use a tool like Schedule Validator, or you can just set it up in a spreadsheet where you just take each month's update. You don't have to be a master scheduler to know what major milestones are. Just set them up in a spreadsheet and just set up some formulas. Did they move this period? And just from month to month, enter the dates in, and you can start measuring what I call trends, right? Scheduling, identifying trends in a project is the 4th thing. And this, once again, we talked about, just getting the technical issues associated with the project to make sure that there's critical path, keeping track of changes that are ongoing in the plan, monitoring the critical path and progress on the critical path. And then the last thing is trying to identify trends. And let me just show you some trends that you can do. Once again, these are things you can do in a spreadsheet if you like. I'm gonna pull it up here in Validator. I'm gonna actually select all my projects and then run my scheduled trends report. Now, out of all of these projects, if I had each one of these projects, my milestones entered in on a spreadsheet, or in this case, I'm tracking, I can run a report each month out of my software, and it'll say I've got this many activities that are on the critical path, and this is the percentage. So here are some trends that I like to look at to see how many activities are on the critical path. What's the percentage? And you can see this project I've got pulled up. The number of, or the percentage of critical path activities was really high, really high. In fact, if you look at the next chart below there, even the near critical activities were pretty high. No should, as one goes up, theoretically the other goes down. If they are both high, if they're both going up, then it's a higher risk. So you can see these two should be fairly tracking along in just the opposite way. And so once again, if I add those two together, if I scroll down to the next little section, percentage of critical and near critical activities are almost at 100% for these. And that, in other words, on a project like this, the way this is scheduled, just about anything that occurs on this project is going to have an impact to my end date. And then there's other trends you can do, looking at the finish date variance. Once again, you can do this in a spreadsheet if you want. Here's just looking at some good trends through the course of the project, and then putting together a good narrative, right? So in this case, with this high risk, this high number of activities on the critical path, that's a high risk that issues are going to impact the schedule. That's why that's such an important number to look at. That is a very, very good risk indicator. So ultimately, for schedule success, you want to be looking at those are four of the major things to be looking at in a construction schedule. Once again, I always encourage stakeholders to get involved with the other stakeholders in the scheduling process. Encourage partnering at the very beginning in the schedule process when it works, because it'll help you become more thorough. It'll make the scheduling process and the review process have a lot more thorough, a lot more dialogue associated with it. And then it helps simplify the process, keeping it simple. Good pictures will paint a lot of clarity. I use the example of my kids. When I used to read stories to them at night, if they had a good picture, they could get the whole story while I just read a few words. So being able to keep your scheduling, the review process simple and direct, and to know why. That's one of the things I like about these narrative generators is they come with good explanations of what the risks are associated with these different schedule issues. And then obviously being flexible. If you have, that's very important. One of the classic examples is using negative float. In theory, you shouldn't use negative float, but there are some cases where the use of negative float is probably the best way to handle some scenarios. And I can think of a few that I've had to use over the years. But so you have to be a little flexible. The key is to identify the issues and address whether it's a good process or not.